Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis, welcome to another episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi here in Walterboro for day, what feels like 5 million of the Alec Murdock double murder trial. Not really. Day 26, defense rested today. So we got that going for us. We're ticking away now. Getting there. Real quick, thank you to Lori and Miss Chewy for your donations. I really appreciate you guys. Also, music fact of the day, The Doors was the very first band to pay to have a billboard put up to promote their album. Elektra Records paid $1,500 to promote, Lord, y'all, brain, tongue, like lips, not in sync, not firing on all synapses together. Elektra Records paid $1,500 to promote their first album on LA's Sunset Strip. And real quick, got to give a big old shout out to the students at St. Vincent's School. They were there today, their mock trial team. They have district on Saturday. So girls, go get it, win it. They were great. Super sweet girls, had a lot of really interesting questions about the trial. So I'm going to have to look online late in the weekend to see if they won. Now, the first witness today was Dr. Okay. Oh, I forgot to tell you. What's up now? So the defense rested. The state has 4, possibly 5 rebuttal witnesses. Mr. Waters says it should not take super long. And Mr. Harpootlian wants the jury to go to Moselle, so they will go to Moselle. And it's going to be a logistical nightmare. It's 1,700 acres. So it's going to be hard to kind of corner all that off and make sure that it's safe to take that jury there, but it'll happen. So I kind of think closing's Thursday, and you never know, guys. This could be a quick verdict, whatever it may be. We'll see. Might be back on my way here next week, and that's cool. We'll see it through. We'll see it to the end. I've met some great friends down here, y'all. It's been a great experience, big learning experience. I love learning new stuff, and Lord, I've learned new stuff doing this long crime. Had a blast. Such a great team. All right, first witness, Dr. Jonathan Eisenstate. He's a pathologist that the defense hired to go over all of the records, all of the reports, the crime scene photos, that kind of thing, to give a little bit of his version of how these shots were delivered and that kind of thing. But first of all, he addresses the coroner, the first witness the defense put up, that we all were like, why is this witness talking about sticking his hand in the armpits to get the temperature? Now, I think now I see why the defense called that witness, because he just discredited how he took the temperatures. He said body temperature is important, obviously, to see how long the body's been there. And you put the thermometer outside to let it acclimate to an ambient temperature, and then you take a rectal temperature. That's a body cavity. It's a very accurate way to measure body temperature. And it's the closest we get to core body temperature, according to him. You can also look at how rigid the body is and blood pooling, but the rectal temperature is the best method. If you remember, the coroner said the opposite. It's not reliable, and this is. Because, I was on a podcast yesterday, and I really kind of had a word salad in my head, and you know how you say things and it just doesn't come out right. Time of death is so important, and we know they were alive at 8:49, right? We know that for a fact because that's their phone's locked. They were reading things until then. But if the time of death is any time after 9:06, then that's a problem, because right now we really don't have a super accurate time of death, other than to know it came sometime between 8:50 and 10:06. But if both bodies have lost a quarter of their body temperature, then that gives you a little bit more of a exculpatory. For example, I'm just saying, for example, but it's something we'll never know, because certain things weren't done that would have provided some answers that may or may not have made a difference. I mean, it could be, hey, look, 8:49 to 9:06 is my death. I mean, yeah, but that was a crazy day of testimony. I'll never forget. We all and I'm not bashing that corner. He was super sweet. I got to say hello to him. Very nice man, and definitely old school. He'd been corner for 30 years, but still, it's I've never heard of anybody putting their hands in their armpits for body temperature. So this witness Dr. Eisenstate looked over the previous pathologist's results and agreed with all but one shot to each body. So they look for directionality of the wounds, tangential wounds. You look for skin tags. So you get tears in skin of the direction that bullet was coming from. Skin tags pointing outward. He thinks the head wound for Maggie was shot from a downward angle. And so if you remember, the previous pathologist thought that first fatal head wound to Maggie came from behind. She's on all fours, shot in the back of the head, moves around to the front and shoots through as she's kind of down on the ground, and it goes through the breast and then through the jaw and then, or the face, and then throughout the back of the head. The thing I didn't know is it blew her earlobe off, and it apparently threw her earring up that it must have left a mark on her skin. Bless her heart. They show some autopsy photos, and he points out these skin tag directions going upward, and he thinks those shots were fired in rapid succession. And he said this is actually a textbook example of a downward direction with the laceration being downward and the skin tags all pointing up. He said beautiful, and he was like, oh, sorry, I shouldn't say this is a beautiful example, but it's textbook, according to him, that Maggie's wounds disputed the direction that first fatal head wound was shot in. And then, so we go to Paul. And I'm not going to go through all of the findings. A lot of it echoes the previous medical examiner's testimony. And so he only disagreed with one headshot on Maggie, one headshot on Paul. There's a lot of talk about the pressure, the gas coming out of the barrel. If Paul's head was shaved, number one, they would have seen searing or soot because he thinks that this was a contact wound, not that it was from 3 feet or more. But remember, the pathologist didn't shave the head, so we'll never know. And he says that he thinks the path is reversed from what the previous medical examiner testified to. So if it goes through if the entrance is on that left shoulder, which remember, he had that wound on his left shoulder, by the time it gets to the left chin, it's lost a lot of energy. So the top of the head wouldn't be completely blown off. There's no nice way to say it. He was missing the top of his skull. So he said 3 feet or further would not have done this. And you also have pellets going down into his tissue, like downward. So that's interesting. And I think that they will call Dr. Kinsey to come back on the stand. If you remember, he was so good for the state. I think maybe my favorite technical witness for the state by far. He explained all these angles so well. And for the first time, I could almost visualize how this happened. I definitely think they're going to call him back on the stand to combat this. And I'm not sure really, it's one of those things that we're never going to know. If she didn't shave his head, we're not going to know ever if this is a contact. We have differences of opinion. Remember, Dr. Kinsey said, nah, somebody would have to be on the roof to make this shot, to where he thinks really it's just that the shooter was flipped and not on Paul's left, but on his right side. So he said the x-ray showed the severity of the skull fracture Paul had. There was just no skull in one spot. And man, it's just such a terrible, terrible way to die, y'all. Every day I think about poor Maggie and what she saw. But the gas needs to go somewhere in the skull. What happens is it expands inside that skull. And so it's causing that to pop out. And possibly pellets in the brain, but the brain, even though it was brought separately, it was never x-rayed. And so the pressure essentially is what he says caused that brain to come out. And the left shoulder, the pellets were dispersed and coming down. So Paul was likely bent over downward, and the chest shot, because that chest shot we know would have been very painful. And Harpootlian wants to enter a book about gunshot wounds, and the state objects, and then we take a break. So the shotgun wounds to the arm, they determine the range of fire. you have what you call scalloped margins. So that's moving about 2 to 3 feet out. And the further you go, you get scalloped margins. And you also get the end of the weapon is at least 4 foot on. So the photo to the large shoulder wound, there's no pellets in the hole. So it's not going from left to right. Pellets would have opened up on that chin area. Remember, they're saying it goes in at the shoulder, then the shotgun would have spread. So there were no pellet holes on the chin. That's one of his justifications. And that kind of does make sense if you think about it. But it from the top, it would have opened up further and dispersed throughout that shoulder area. So he thinks that this shot came downward, left to right, and contact. So why wasn't the brain shredded? Why did it come out whole? So the shotgun shell is still intact as it goes into the body. So the initial report, the brain was brought pretty much in a separate bucket, and the brain had trauma. But when asked if you think about the previous pathologist was wrong about direction, he says yes. He said, I wouldn't take a case if someone said this is what we want to hear. There's blood, there's brain, there's skull. It's a blowout, essentially. The muzzle, in his opinion, was against the skin. So that's kind of his testimony. I just don't want to regurgitate the whole pathology that we've heard before. And you can go back and listen to that if you haven't caught up yet, but that was essentially was he disagreed on 2 of the headshots and how they were delivered. So Tim Tombach, I hope I said that right. He talks about how much he's paid, and he was asked, y'all. He was asked to review everything. He actually went to Moselle Friday morning. He began with Paul's right shoulder to the door. So the first shot we know through the chest, exits the side of the chest, the arm, enters the arm, exits the arm. So it's kind of a boom, boom, boom out. Poor kid. He had over 20 entry and exit wounds. The shooter outside the door, but that muzzle could have been coming. He was surprised by that shot, or otherwise he thinks he would have turned and faced that door and it not been at a side angle. First was buckshot to the chest, we know. And because of what happened to his brain, the only explanation really is a high energy source, a contact wound. So on the door at the top, there was hair and blood, and the gas builds in your head, essentially. And so the quickest way to leave is already that entrance wound, which they're just explaining how the brain was just ejected from the skull. You see dings on the door, and he saw it at Moselle. So those dings are still in that door now. They must not have replaced that door. He said that the wound was elongated, so it came from the bottom up, and there's pellets still in the shelf in the wood. He saw that last week. So the question was, how do you get indentions at the top of the door if the trajectory is downward? So contact wound to the skull, the shooter is getting, he said at this point, the shooter is getting hit with brain matter, blood matter, skin, skull, some pellets. Injury could be possible. It's substantial force. So in his opinion, this close, the shooter could have had wounds just from the spray of biological materials from the force of that gunshot wound. The clothing would have a lot of that on the upper body, especially. So there was a void pattern we know on that door. So on the door frame, you see an area where there's no blood. Dr. Kinsey thought it was Paul. And this doctor thought that it was the shooter. And he noted that Dr. Kinsey relied on the previous pathologists, and he disagrees with that void being Paul. None of this, in his opinion, is consistent with upward trajectory, but more downward. So they show the jury some photos of Paul, left side of face and the shoulder. And the jaw and shoulder wounds just, oh man, the jaw had a smaller hole, and the distribution of pellets over the distance, which we know went through the windows. So Paul was at the door. The shooter was just to the right of that door. And The upper left corner, there was a large transfer on that door. Remember, Dr. Kinsey said that the brain literally hit the door 3 times before it rested at his feet. He said there was lots of hair in that area and extensive blood spatter and small velocity, just lots of velocity. The jury was watching Alec cry, by the way. I noticed several jurors watch him cry. I have that in my notes here. I try to write notes when I see the jury react to anything. So in a picture, they show the final resting position of Paul with his brain next to his left leg. Lots of spatter in that area. His feet are on the right side of the door. And man, large brain mass by the knee, inches away, maybe from the hip area. Large skull fracture. It was off the cement path, y'all. There were parts of skull off that cement. And so they show a picture looking downward at the feed room. There's a vertical drip pattern from the chest. And so they see movement that shows them there was movement to the door from Paul. He said it's not possible that the shooter was in the room, more outside reaching in, like Dr. Kinsey testified, that maybe the barrel of that shotgun had breached the door. So the length, he said, we don't know the length of the gun. He assumes maybe it was a shorter barrel, and that's it. So with Maggie, all wounds were facing the direction of the shooter. She is moving, but not much. The shooter moved towards her final resting place. And there was actually hair laying on the top of her legs, and that was her final position. Maggie's shooter could have possibly had blood or tissue on their person because brain matter was found in a backwards direction. And that could have put blood on the shooter or tissue or biological material. So this is kind of the thing I think this guy was brought in to do, which is to say, in his opinion, it's very, very possible there could have been 2 shooters. And he said it's very suggestive of a 2-person shooter scenario. We know the shooter had to be, you can see pieces of skull in the feed room and tissue and hair on the doors and the ceiling, and all that in alignment with the shooter getting covered with bone fragments, which could cause injury, that kind of thing, just would make it hard to go grab another long gun, is essentially the point he was making. He said they were very close, more than you can see in photos as far as the bodies. He said Paul was shot first, no clue it was coming. And if Maggie had been in the vicinity, she probably would have run to Paul, which would have run her into the shooter. And why 2 shooter? Why would 2 shooters, why would a shooter bring 2 long guns to a murder, in other words, if one weapon is a 300 blackout? So in other words, why are you switching between the 2? If it's one shooter, you shoot with the same gun. And I guess it would have been smarter to use the shotgun because you really just can't trace those like you can regular cartridge casings. So if it was a 10-round clip, 8 of those were used. And tips, it just tilts toward 2 shooters, according to him. It's a question that I have because we just don't know the exact timeline. The one thing about the phones going silent at 8:49, what we know from every witness who's ever been in that kennel, that the reception was bad. So things like that don't make me certain that 8:49 was the last time they were alive. Although then you look at the timeline, you've got Maggie making steps at 8:54, and you think, is she running to go check on her son? Because there's no way that Paul stood there, made his way towards the door, got shot a second time in 10 seconds. There was some time there. And I talked last episode about my theory that maybe, she was running. And that's kind of what was said. There were no fingerprints taken in the feed room, by the way, and no evidence that footwear was looked at as far as any foot impressions in that might belong to somebody else. So after lunch, John Marvin finished up for the defense. I will say this, the jury liked him a lot. They got emotional. I saw one. Now, okay, I'll say this. Look, pollen's terrible down here. It's bad. I washed my car yesterday. It's covered in yellow again. It's just the South and what we say is the first spring, because we'll have another cold spell But this is the first spring. The pollen comes out. The bees are like, yay, it's spring. And then, it's like, no, it's not. Get your coats back out. That's how we roll in the South. But I will say there was a juror that I did see who was wiping her nose and her eyes, whether or not it was in relation to the testimony or the pollen, I don't know. But I will say, as a whole, he had them laughing a couple of times. And at one point, I didn't see a juror that didn't have somewhat of a sympathetic look on his face. So it might have been a strong witness for the defense to finish with. I think he lives in Beaufort, which is about an hour to an hour and a half from here. He is the only son who didn't go to law school, and he says he's quite proud he didn't. He talks about them being a normal family, like getting together and things like that. Now, I will note too, at the beginning of this, Alec and Dick Harpootlian were talking back and forth a good bit, a lot. So I wish I could read lips, but I can't. Now, Alec visited his parents frequently. We talk about that. And then they talk about Paul, and he cries. He said, I knew Paul very well. They had a very special relationship, and it seems very, very much so from everything we've heard. He's asked about nicknames, which is Paw Paw and Little Rooster. And he said, when we were having fun, everybody called him Paw Paw. And then at work, because Paul worked for John Marvin, Lord, y'all, I have to say it was very sincere when he was crying for Paul today. I'm going to tell you, I think that could have been about the strongest witness they could have finished with, at least in just a family sense, because it was well received. But when Paul worked for him, he called him Paul Terry, just in a more professional sense. But he said all the family called him Paw Paw, because I'm sure over the weekend everybody's watched all these things and read articles and stuff, and they're like, oh, you calling him Paw Paw now, so we'll have family clarify. But it was used in fun and normal times. So Paul had worked for him 2 summers prior to the murders, just in the summers, only like a month and a half when he's out of school. And he worked in the Bluffton and Okeechobee store. So he would wash the equipment, talk to customers, help load and unload rental equipment. And he said Paul was a hard worker. And John Marvin, by the way, owns a hunting property called Greenfield. A lot of people were asking me if it was Greenville. It's Greenfield. Sounds the same, but not quite. He talks about Alec's relationship with Paul and Buster. He said it was great. He said if he had invited the 3 of them to go duck hunt with him, if the boys said, yeah, we'll come, but changed their mind, then Alec just wouldn't come. He spent his time with his boys. He said he and Maggie had a great relationship. It was a good marriage. He gave an example where they went to a Darius Rucker concert, and he went and got 15 beers, $15 beers, not 15 beers, sorry, $15 beers. And his wife taps him and points. And he said, Alec and Maggie were holding hands and kind of slow dancing. And she said, why aren't you swaying with me? So he said he put down his $15 beer and did that. It was kind of cute. The jury did laugh at that. So Paul left guns everywhere. Like we say, he would leave all of his clothes everywhere. He's just validating what we've heard about Paul. So they talk about riding the property. John Marvin said he doesn't always carry a gun, and never when he was with his dad. So the weekend before the murders, we know Randolph was let out of the hospital, readmitted after a doctor's appointment. And then he was in the hospital in Columbia. He got out on a Sunday, and he was having breathing difficulty still. So he took him to the doctor in Savannah, which is his normal doctor group. Huge breathing issues. They admitted him. And originally they just went to go to the doctor to see why he wasn't breathing well. And they weren't sure if this was pneumonia or just a progression of the cancer. So it would have been better if it was just pneumonia, because they would have had treatment options. But if it's the cancer, and he said he was in poor health all around, had some heart issues and cancer in multiple places. But they were hopeful this was just pneumonia, which was treatable. And for like a day, they thought it was pneumonia, but unfortunately it was the cancer. So on June 7th, John Marvin, if you remember, he did that family text, which was just that basic summary that we've heard that, he's going to see his dad, that kind of thing. And then Tuesday afternoon, Randy called and said he was terminal and would need to go to hospice. He died after the murders, as we know. He died on the 10th, which is 3 days after the murders. So we talk about these cars being shifted around because we know Paul's truck was found on the side of the road, which a lot of people didn't know that until this trial. And it was sort of like, whoa, that's suspicious. But Monday, to get dad to the hospital, Randy knew he needed to be seen. And they didn't have an appointment, but Randy was able to get him worked in and asked John Marvin to take him right away. So because he is further away than any of the other siblings, Randy met him halfway in Ridgeland. And so they got in Libby's car, and John Marvin took the truck to Alameda. Now, John Marvin he drove his mom's car to Alameda, and he brought his truck to Moselle. And Paul's truck was in the shop in Varnville. But Alec called on his way to Alameda. He said he was checking in, and he saw on the news about Randolph. I think I heard that right, that he heard on the news that his dad was going back in the hospital. So his demeanor was normal. And then he said the last time that he saw Randy took John Marvin's truck to his mother's. I apologize. And all driving had he and John Marvin. And so the last time he saw Paul was outside playing with John Marvin's kids in the yard. So Alec called him about the murders, and he was watching TV with his wife without the kids. And he was told about the murders, and he realized he didn't have a car, but Paul's truck, which he called a hunk of junk. He got in and headed to Moselle. So on the way, Randy asked to get in touch with Danny Henderson. Danny Henderson is somebody we're going to talk about here in just a second, but the car breaks down. So the truck breaks down, and someone called. He wasn't sure if it was Alec or Randy, and said the sheets were being pulled over the bodies. Greg Alexander, who's a cop in Yemassee, told him something happened. So they kind of meet up, and the police captain is ahead of him in his car, but the truck's sputtering at this point. John Marvin's just not sure if it's going to make it. So eventually the truck breaks down, and he had to call Greg Alexander, the cop. I think he's like a sheriff. I'll have to look down here. Sorry. He didn't see any guns in the truck, by the way. He said, I was frantic, but I really stuck out to him. So when he got to Moselle, there was tons of people there, first responders. He got maybe there around 11 and stayed there until they went to the main house, which was about 2 or 3 a.m. So that he came in the main gate. When he got there, John Marvin saw Alec and ran to him and said he was broken and distraught at the house. And at the house, he didn't see SLED agents, by the way. In the house, there were people there. Didn't see food, but did see the pots and pans, which were cleaned up by people there. He doesn't remember if the TV was on or not, but he said, based on what I know, the TV was always on if Alec or Maggie were there. He went to Alameda later with Buster, his girlfriend Brooke, and Alec. And Alec was wearing the shorts and the t-shirt. So on June 8th, they get up. He said, I don't think I slept at all. And they were going to Greenfield to shower. He was going to Greenfield to shower and change, and said he would meet them at Moselle. So he was the first one there, actually, and he just sat in disbelief, and he didn't know if the door to the house was unlocked. So he said he knew the key code, and he decided to go to the kennels first. He needed to see what went on and just to take it in. And so he stayed at the kennels a bit. He wasn't sure if he should go down there. So he actually reached out to a friend in law enforcement to make sure that scene was cleared, and it was. So he went there, and he said it hadn't been cleaned yet. There were still skull fragments. He gets very emotional talking about this. He said, and stuff. You could see where Maggie was. They had covered that with dirt, so it wasn't super graphic, but he went into the feed room, and he said, y'all can just imagine what I saw. He said there was brain matter, skull, tissue. It was just, he thought he needed to clean it up for Paul. Just the last thing he could do for that young man. So no mom, dad, aunt, or uncle should have to do that, is what he said. He said, I was just so overwhelmed. And he was very emotional talking about this. It was quite sad. he called Randy, and Randy told him to stop. This isn't healthy for you to do. And John Marvin said, I have to do this for Paul. So 20 minutes later, Mark Ball came and said it's okay to leave, just to leave that area. He said it's the hardest thing he's ever done in his life, and he was sobbing. And this is when I saw somebody get very emotional in that jury. The whole jury was very sympathetic at this point, and that's what I have right here. Maggie's phone had not been located yet, and a group of lawyers were questioning kind of what do we do? So if Buster or Alec has Find My Friends, Find My iPhone, that kind of thing, you can maybe find it. So he pinged her phone and he said, pardon my French, but we said, holy crap. He said something else. There it is. So they took Buster's phone to go show law enforcement that they had pinged her phone. And he said, we have technology coming later today and we will find it. And he said it blew him away. In other words, according to John Marvin, they brushed him off and said, yeah, it's okay. We got our own people coming. So Duffy Stone, who was the solicitor that was recused, he said, let's go find her phone. And they found it very quickly. And John Marvin was standing there on the side of the road, the opposite side, there's a cow pasture. And he was standing there and he heard somebody say, I've got it. And so they marked the location and called SLED. And an agent came and got that phone. John Marvin was asked if he knew the password. He called Alec and got it open. So they talk about the news release where there's no alarm to the public. And John Marvin thought it was baffling. And he said, I still think it's baffling to this day. There's 2 people dead. He thought maybe they had just found him when they made that release. And he said, if not, nobody is safe. He went to Moselle after they found the phone. And that's when SLED came to search with that whole group of people there. They talk about needing to search. And so John Marvin escorted them through the house. And, when my phone rings when I'm doing this, it really just distracts me. But like my messages are full. Seriously, y'all. My day is so full here. I don't even have time to answer texts unless it's like for my kids. So John Marvin said that he escorted the officers through the house, and she didn't want to give an appearance of, I guess, being aggressive or barging in. So she took her badge and her gun off while she was searching, and she was looking for 12-gauge shotgun and blackouts, as well as the ammo that would go with those guns. And she looked at spaces where guns would fit. He took her through every room. She opened the door to the shower, looked in there, looked down at the floor, and most of the guns were in the gun room. He's hunted with Alec over the years. He said Alec really doesn't have a particular gun he used. Turkey hunting, he would use a 12-gauge 2 years before. That was kind of the last time he saw him. I guess they must have been hunting together 2 years before. He was the point person initially for the family and for SLED. And he told Agent Owens, call me if you need anything. We'll get it done. We'll get it to you, however we can help. So he was trying to further that investigation any way he could. John Marvin said, I've consented every time they've asked to do something, and they talk about his mom's house, and nobody asked him to search that house. Nobody asked for permission or consent. He said, I would have given them consent and taken them over there, even to areas on the property they did not know about. SLED came to his Greenfield hunting property to interview John Marvin, Randy, Alec, and Buster. They were all there, and the agents, he said he offered for them to come inside, and they said, no, we just want to get started. So they were interviewed simultaneously in separate cars. He said there were also 2 to 3 more cars there that weren't conducting interviews. So they talk about the audio of Alec's interview on June the 10th, where it's the I did them so bad, they did them so bad. And John Marvin said they did him so bad. And he said it the day the murders happened, that night, several times since. So after the murders, he was with Alec for a long time. And he said, as his brother, I needed to be with him. I needed to be right there with him. His demeanor, as we've heard, destroyed, broken, any words you could think of to say just extreme grief. But he said, words don't do it justice. I really need to make up my own word to express what Alec was going through. He thought at times he was okay, and then just broken, sheer grief. He said Alec was heavy going into the murders and dropped weight quickly. And we saw that. If you look at his mugshot, that very first one, it's been June, 3 months. And you've got a lot of weight dropped. I've seen pictures of him out too during that time, but he had heard numerous times that it could have been related to the boat crash. And he talks about the backlash in the community. He said social media was way worse. And he said the media inflamed the rumors, which just created a hot mess. John Marvin called a friend to see if he could come to the crime scene, and he said they talked. And in that conversation, he asked me, "Do you think this could be from the boat crash?" And there's an objection, which is sustained. John Marvin talks about parking at Alameda. He tells where you can park. He said he actually parked there yesterday when he went to see her. Miss Libby's birthday was yesterday, he said. They show a photo of the house, and then it's just kind of near that tree line where the Pings have Alec going, and we all were like, why are you going to the tree line? But it seems like Buster and John Marvin both testified that's where they parked. So Labor Day weekend of 2021, he had been on a trip and came home Saturday night. John Marvin did not know about the opioid addiction prior to this roadside shooting and that little aftermath. So Randy and John Marvin took him to detox near Atlanta. He said his condition, Alec's condition in the car, he said, I've seen TV shows about detox, but he was sweating, kind of thrashing. Halfway there, he took the seatbelt off, and he said he would just put his head down in the seat just to stretch his legs. He also said he had that Alec had uncontrollable diarrhea on himself in the car, just couldn't control it. To Orlando, they drove him to rehab. Alec was different, more subdued, not jerky, but he talked about one instance where he woke up from what seemed to be a nightmare, a bad dream. He said, I think he was seeing what he found that night in his dream. And it took him a minute to kind of get his composure and realize he was in the present. In September, sled search Alameda, and John Marvin was there. They took a coat, and Agent Owen said, we found a coat. Do you know about it? And so he said his dad rides Kubota, and it is probably his. He said maybe Lynn or Randy and John Marvin actually were asked to ID that coat and then listen to that kennel tape. Originally, they said that the jacket was found on the property, and then another time he said they told him it was in the house. He said he'd never seen the coat before, and he was a little suspicious about the two different locations, they said. He said he still doesn't know to this day where it was actually found. We do have the picture, I believe, in Randolph's closet was where it was found. So the gunshot residue on the raincoat, he didn't carry guns a lot, Mr. Randolph, but if he went hunting, he would ride around with it for 2 months. In other words, if he went dove hunting one day, that gun would be on him for 2 months in his car, I guess. And he talks about his dad had a gun that he got in 1957 for graduation. He used it to hunt everything. Never saw him clean it. If you remember, there was excessive amounts of gunshot residue on the inside of that jacket. They could not get any DNA profile. There was not enough to get it. But so Sled updates him, and Agent Owens, he said they tried to provide him updates, and then they talk about Alec's t-shirt that he wore the night of the murders. So they were at a meeting with Sled in Walterboro for the coat and to listen to that kennel video and identify Alec's voice. And they talk about a white shirt covered in blood that on body cam, he wiped his face with that shirt. And they said that implicated Alex as being the murderer. Sled asked John Marvin, his sister, and Randy to come look at the coat. So they went into Ryan Neal's office, and they talked about that that jacket and the shirt and everything, and the kennel video at that meeting with them. So they talk about Papa T, which is Maggie's dad. Unfortunately, he's homebound now. He's had a stroke. He's not doing very well. It sounds like he has a caregiver. He says they're wonderful people, and that Alec would golf with Papa T, and that they used to vacation together back in when times were good. So June 8th, they talk about the kennel again cleaning up. Do you remember making a promise that day? And he said, y'all know I loved him. And he said, I told Paul I loved him and I would find out who did this to him. So the last question, have you found that person? And he says, I have not. So without saying, do you think your brother did this? They asked that way. So on Cross, do you feel, they acknowledge right out of the gate, you and your family suffered a great tragedy. And he said, yeah, we have. I mean, you think about it. Think about like the little cousins, all right? Like think about his children that he says that Paul was close to and played with. Yeah, they lost Paul, Maggie, a grandfather just boom, boom, boom within a matter of days. You think about the extended family, the grandkids and the cousins, and unimaginable losses for people who are uninvolved in all this. You know what I'm saying? People, it kind of makes me wonder why a lot of people don't see the Murdaughs as victims in the murders. There's other things we could sit here, and I'm gonna be honest with you guys. Like, I don't know half the rumors out there about this family. I have watched the HBO documentary. That's it. That is pretty much the extent of what I know about, other than what law enforcement has put out there. But for me, um, there's been a lot of comments that, like, they're not entitled to just be devastated and grieve, and I think that they are. So they talk about cooperation of letting them search things, and he said, I definitely have cooperated fully the whole time. But they kind of turn that and say, when did you know your brother was at the kennels? And he said, when I met with Sled. This was in August of 2022. August 12th is what the prosecutor said. Did Alec tell you about being at the kennels? And he said, I don't know that we've had an opportunity to speak about it, meaning since he's been arrested and in jail. So, but they also talk about the fact that Alec lied to Sled, and John Marvin admits 100% he lied to Sled, and that's not fully cooperative. So Paul's normal day, he drove the white F-150 Platinum. They have the same identical truck. And then Monday at the end of the day, he's in Paul's truck. Paul has John Marvin's truck, and he came after Alec called him. Where was your truck? He said, I went to the kennels when I got there. It was in front of the house. The keys Paul were using, they were in the ignition in the same place he always left. John Marvin always left them as well. So the farm truck, as we know, when he drove it, broke down going to Moselle. He said that the chief that he was with were driving in separate cars, but they were close together. So you're aware, Alec loaned Chief Alexander money several times over the last few years. One thing, he got a $5,000 check in July after the murders. Very curious. See, we haven't seen the last of who might be affected by Alec Murdaugh's schemes. I don't think we've seen the half of accomplices or people involved. And I'm not saying that this person specifically, but I'm just saying we ain't seen nothing yet. He says he learned the opioid habit Labor Day weekend, that roadside shooting. Remember, Alec went to detox, then he went to rehab, and then he was arrested after he left rehab. But he didn't know before then. And he said he looked sober. He didn't see him daily like the other siblings might have, but he said, I had no reason to think he was on drugs. June 8th, he was the first there as he testified and the last to leave. Blanca came in after him. We know she cleaned up. So in the gun room at some point, Sled body cam is in there. They're talking about autopsies. Actually, they're telling John Marvin what to expect about. Maggie and Paul were being autopsied at that very moment. And so the agent there was I just watched this last night, by the way. The agent was telling him what to expect about maybe getting the bodies back, but tell him that it might take longer because there are two victims. So on October 12th of 2021, Sled came to his house and they interviewed Buster as well as John Marvin's wife. That was Agent Croft and Agent Kelly that came to his house. And they interviewed John Marvin and his wife together and Buster separately by himself. So the subject of the blue jacket comes back up, and he doesn't recall when Sled asked about the blue jacket. He didn't recognize the jacket. And then it says, what was Buster's answer when he was asked? And there was objections. So that we never got. I didn't hear what was said after that. Driving to rehab from detox, Alec woke up and seemed terrified about finding bodies. And John Marvin said, that's what it appeared. He didn't say that specifically, but he just assumed that might have been what the source of the nightmare was. He said it was fear, and it took him several seconds to kind of come back to reality. So on June 7th, his dad, as we know, was in the hospital. They were hopeful that it would be okay, but he sent the group text that with Alec and to Maggie, and it says, if your brother told Jeannie Seckinger that dad took a turn for the worse, that wasn't true. So we're talking about the day of the murders. See, remember, Alec got the text that his dad was terminal. John Marvin said, if someone said terminal, they were wrong. So what they're getting at is that Alec lied to Jean because on the 7th, Randolph was terminal, but they didn't know it. The doctors had not done enough tests to confirm confirm that this was the cancer. So they were just bringing that up and cross a really good point too, just avoiding it, using that sympathy to get it to stop. Yeah, that was a really good point by the defense. I mean, by the state. So the Murdaugh name and legacy, was that important to you? He said, any family, no more than yours or anyone else's. And so that was the end, and the defense rests. There was a renewed motion for a direct verdict that was denied. So Creighton Waters says 4 maybe 5 witnesses, and he thinks he can get those done in one day for rebuttal, not lengthy. And Harpootlian said he's skeptical it will get done tomorrow. But yeah, so that's kind of it today, y'all. I think that John Marvin did a fantastic job on the stand as far as their point of putting him up, because the jury liked him. He seemed sincere, and I think that really was influential for the jury to see that he was sincere. And like I say, a lot of the jurors seemed very sympathetic. I really saw maybe one or two that just was more poker face, but you kind of see that pain. Like, I feel sorry for you. I'm so sorry for what you had to see. Look, and like I say, I don't know if that one juror what, but that was what happened. So tomorrow, rebuttal should be interesting. I hope Dr. Kinsey's back up. I love hearing him talk, but we'll bring it to you tomorrow night. In the meantime, you can catch me on Law and Crime at breaks, updating you in our lunch. Anjanette's in town. It's been so nice having her here. And so anyways, we're going to see it to the end, which, guys, I think we see the light at the end of the tunnel. All right. Have a good one.